"You touch that crib and I swear I'll throw you over myself." The wind tore through the granite cliffs, but Marnie's voice cut through sharper than the cold. She stood with her back to the drop, one boot half slipped on loose gravel, her fingers curled around a rusted shepherd's hook like it was a weapon. Across from her, the young forest officer hesitated. He hadn't even taken a full step toward the ledge, but now he froze, unsure whether to move or speak again. Below them, the cliffs dropped off into a broken sea of pine. Somewhere far beneath, the river screamed like a memory of something that had once begged for mercy. But up here, in this strange clearing between two slabs of rock, the world was mute. Still, except for the dog. The shepherd, a monstrous creature with graying ears and one milky eye, didn't even glance at them. He sat facing the crib, if one could call it that, like a sentry guarding a grave. The thing had been crafted from bones, not twigs. Bleached rib arcs, tiny vertebrae woven with moss, a curved spine like a cradle's rail. No one had built it by accident. Marnie's breath was short, not from the climb, but from the weight in her chest. She hadn't planned on returning here. She never wanted to. But when the reports came about a dog who wouldn't move from the cliff edge, about strange bones found beneath an old fire tower, she knew exactly where they were talking about. And she'd known exactly who the dog was. Brannock hadn't left, not after all these years. "You're not supposed to be here alone," the officer said. A little softer this time, maybe realizing this wasn't a trespassing incident anymore. "Not alone," she replied, her voice brittle. He looked at the dog, then the bones. Something shifted behind his eyes, not fear, exactly, but the first uncomfortable taste of a story too heavy to carry. He stepped back. Marnie waited until he was gone before she moved again. She crouched beside Brannock slowly, her knees protesting, the cold biting through the seams in her jeans. The shepherd's tail didn't move, he didn't blink. His body was still as stone, yet something in his stillness pulsed like grief, ancient and unyielding. "Still guarding her," whispered, "even when there's nothing left to guard." She reached a hand toward the crib, and Brannock didn't growl. Not like he used to, in the early days, when the smell of blood still lingered on the rocks and the memory of screaming hadn't yet faded. No, now he only watched, eyes wet, chest rising, slow and deliberate. Marnie's fingers brushed the bones. They were dry, cold. One of them had a little necklace tied around it, a fraying ribbon with a carved wooden button shaped like a bird. She closed her eyes. Back then, when the winter storm had hit and the signal went out, it had taken them 2 days to reach the tower. The snow was too thick. The roads were gone, and by the time they found the sled, the baby, the bodies, by the time they found Brannock curled around the tiny girl wrapped in fur, the others had already frozen, or vanished or broken. She didn't tell anyone about the crib. Not then. She had dismantled it, buried the bones, or so she thought. But grief has its own logic. Maybe Brannock rebuilt it, or maybe it rebuilt itself out of loyalty, or sorrow, or some older, darker instinct. No one ever questioned why a dog would stay behind. They just called it trauma. But Marnie knew better. Some promises don't fade with time. Some things cannot be buried deep enough. She sat with him until the sun dipped below the ridge and the cold began to hum beneath her skin. He leaned into her slightly, that old familiar pressure against her thigh, the same way he used to do when the baby cried. "You can let go," she said, barely audible, but Brannock didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the crib, and far in the valley below, a sound like a lullaby drifted up, carried not by voice, but by wind through pine. A high, broken tone like a cradle's creak, or a child's breath in sleep. Something old had returned to this place, or maybe it had never left. And on the cliff's edge, the bones gleamed wider in the dusk. Marnie stayed until the stars blinked awake, 100 cold eyes watching from the black. She hadn't planned to sit so long, hadn't planned anything, at all, really. That was the trouble with coming back to the places you survive. Your body remembers even when your mind wants to forget. She rose slowly, stiff, knees crackling, and Brannock shifted just enough to acknowledge her movement. The crib remained untouched. She didn't dare by the time she reached her truck. The forest officer's vehicle was gone, but a white note flapped under her windshield wiper. "Call me, they're sending a team in the morning." No signature, just a number. She crumpled it without reading further and let the wind carry it into the trees. Let them send whoever they wanted. They'd never find what they were looking for. That night, she stayed in her old Ranger cabin. No one had used it in over 7 years, but her key still fit, and the silence inside welcomed her like a forgotten song. Dust covered the stove. A spider had woven a kingdom in the window corner, and on the coat rack, still hanging, was the red flannel she'd worn the day they lost the baby. She sat on the edge of the cot and clutched the shirt to her chest. The memories came in pieces. Not vivid scenes, but fragments. The way the baby had squealed when Brannock nudged her bottle closer. The feel of the girl's hand, not yet strong enough to grip, but warm and pulsing with life. Marnie had never known if she was orphaned or abandoned. She'd only known she was alive. Until she wasn't. She fell asleep like that, hunched, forward, half dreaming, half guarding a grief that never softened. And when she woke, the first thing she heard was the sound of Brannock's bark. It was distant, but sharp, urgent. She was on her feet in seconds, boots barely laced as she ran out into the morning chill. The path to the cliff had iced over in patches, slick and shadowed, but her feet found it without thought. The bark rang again, louder, wilder. It wasn't just warning, it was pleading. When she reached the ledge, her heart locked in her chest. Brannick was pacing not beside the crib, but in front of it, blocking something from view. His fur was bristled, tail stiff, but he didn't snarl. He whimpered. Marnie circled closer, and then she saw what he was guarding. A child, small, maybe 2 years old, dressed in nothing but a threadbare nightgown. Her hair matted, skin flushed, from cold but not yet blue. She sat curled inside the bone crib, eyes wide open, unblinking, no tears, no motion, as if she'd been waiting there for someone to find her. Marnie dropped to her knees. Her first thought was that she was hallucinating some cruel echo dredged up by grief and guilt. But the girl's breath fogged the air. Her chest rose and fell. This was no ghost. She looked up at Brannick, who backed away just enough for Marnie to reach in. Where did she come from? She whispered, but the question was pointless. There were no nearby roads, no camps, no recent search reports, and no one in their right mind would leave a child on this ledge, in this place alone. Marnie scooped the girl into her arms. She was light, too light, bones and skin, but warm somehow. And as she held her, something inside Marnie, something long buried, cracked open. The girl didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared with those impossibly calm eyes, like she knew. Marnie ran back to the cabin, moving faster than she thought her body could. She wrapped the girl in every blanket she could find, started the old gas stove, and boiled water for tea. Her fingers shook, but not from cold. Brannick followed and laid beside the girl without hesitation. He rested his chin near her feet, body coiled protectively. When the girl finally made a sound, it wasn't a word, just a soft hum, tuneless, broken, but familiar. The kind of sound a baby might make if it had once heard someone sing to it. Marnie sat across from them, still trying to piece the impossibility. Who left her? How had she survived? And why this crib? She thought again of the bones of the ones she had buried years ago, and the ones that had somehow returned, rebuilt into that twisted monument of sorrow. Had the forest unearthed them? Had Brannick, or had something else pulled them from the earth, reshaped them for another child? That afternoon, the sky darkened early. A storm was rolling in, thick and silent. Marnie felt it before she saw it. The kind of storm that didn't just bring snow, but memory. She stood at the cabin window and watched as shadows lengthened. Across the trees, she didn't call the number on the note. She sees OULD and single quotes T. Because some part of her, the part that remembered the baby's warmth, the silence after the search parties gave up, the impossibility of Brannick's loyalty, knew this wasn't a child who had wandered into the woods. She had returned to a place that never forgot, and Marnie, whether she wanted to or not, had been chosen to remember by nightfall. The wind carried something strange with it, not the usual howling through pine or the brittle creaks of frostbitten limbs, but a low rhythmic murmur. It wasn't coming from the trees or the cliffs. It pulsed from within, from the child. She had barely moved all day, but now she sat upright on the cot, eyes locked on the window, her lips moving in silence, as though repeating a lullaby no one else could hear. Marnie watched her from the table, elbows braced, hands wrapped tight around a mug of untouched tea. Brannick had refused to eat, refused to rest. He lay coiled like a watchman at the girl's feet, ears twitching at sounds only he could decipher. Every once in a while his tail would thump once against the wood floor, a warning, a question, or maybe a memory trying to claw its way back. The fire popped once, and the girl turned her head. Marnie's breath caught in her throat. Those eyes, they were too old. Not just in that poetic, eerie way that people sometimes described quiet children. These eyes carried time. There was weight behind them, recognition. And when they locked with Marnie's, something inside her chest shuddered like a cold hand reaching into a wound she thought had long closed. She rose slowly, knelt beside the cot, and reached for the child's small hand. It was warm, real, trembling slightly. Marnie didn't know what she expected, words, tears, anything. But the girl only whispered one name, Uni. It wasn't her voice that chilled Marnie, it was the word itself. Junie. That was the name she had given the baby 7 years ago. Not officially. No records had ever been filed. Just a soft nickname, spoken into firelight, used for the days she nursed the infant in secret before the others found the tower. She'd never told anyone, not the search team, not the volunteers. She hadn't even admitted it to herself after the death was logged as exposure, and the child's body was sent off to some unmarked corner of a state morgue. But now this girl, this impossibility had spoken it. She recoiled, not in fear, but in grief, raw and scraping. That the girl blinked, then laid back down, curling against Brannick's warmth like it was the only safe place left in the world. Marnie sat there for a long time, watching her breathe, trying to understand what could not be understood. The next morning the storm hit. It didn't come with noise or thunder, it came with silence, the kind of snow that falls straight down, heavy and absolute. By noon, the trees were buried to their waists, the path to the cliffs gone entirely. The radio was dead. Her phone blinked, no signal. Marnie didn't panic. This wasn't the first time she'd been snowed in. But what made her uneasy was how expected it all felt, as if nature had arranged it this way, to keep them sealed in that night. The girl spoke again, not in English, not in any language Marnie could identify. She whispered in sleep, a hushed chant, rhythmic and slow, like breath over bones. And then, as if summoned by that rhythm, the cabin began to change. It started with the windows frosting from the inside, not a normal film of ice, but a pattern, spirals, circles, concentric loops that pulsed like veins. Marnie tried to wipe them away, but the patterns returned. Then the air grew heavier, not colder, just full, as though the room was no longer entirely hers. She sat on the floor, watching, waiting, trying to ground herself in reason. This was a child, a lost child, maybe feral, maybe traumatized. There had to be a rational explanation. But then the girl sat up again, not slowly. This time her eyes were open, locked on the door. Brannick stood beside her in perfect silence, ears flat, hackles rising. Marnie followed their gaze. The shape stood just beyond the doorframe, tall, still, no knock, no sound, just the unmistakable presence of something that was never meant to be. Outside. She didn't move, didn't blink. And when she finally dared to reach for the rifle above the stove, the girl let out a soft moan, not of fear, but longing, like she knew the thing waiting outside. The knob didn't turn. The shape didn't shift. It simply remained. After what felt like hours, the pressure lifted. The shape receded into the snow, vanishing into the trees. But something had changed. The girl was crying now, silently, her little fists clenched tight. Brannick lay flat against her side, his body no longer on guard, but protective, desperate, like he was shielding her from something he couldn't fight. Marnie held her for the rest of the night. The girl's body trembled in waves, and though her eyes never closed, she never spoke again. By dawn, the frost symbols on the window had disappeared, but on the cabin floor, right by the threshold, a perfect ring of ash had formed. No fire had touched that spot. No embers had escaped. It hadn't been there hours before. Marnie swept it up carefully, wrapping the soot in an old cloth. Something told her not to let it scatter. Not yet. Outside, the path to the cliff had cleared, not by shovel, not by plow, but by wind. A neat, precise corridor carved through the snow. Beckoning, the girl was already standing by the door, barefoot, eyes fixed on the trail. Brannick stood beside her, and when Marnie reached for her jacket, heart pounding, she knew there would be no going back this time. The forest had remembered its dead, and now it wanted the truth. The path to the cliff wasn't just cleared, it was carved, as though something immense and deliberate had moved through the snow without touching the trees or breaking a single branch. The wind was absent, the air too still, too aware. Marnie stepped carefully. The girl clutched close to her chest, Brannick at her side. She had wrapped the child in an old quilt, but it was more instinct than comfort. The girl's body radiated warmth from within, a kind of quiet heat that never flickered. The journey that once took 30 minutes passed in half that time, as though the trail itself wanted them to hurry. There were no sounds of animals, no birdsong, not even the creak of snow underfoot, just the hush, that strange suspended silence that had begun the moment the girl arrived. And when the cliff finally revealed itself again, Marnie stopped. Something was different. The bone crib was gone. In its place, at the very edge where the stone bowed out like a cradle, sat a circle of stones, 12 of them, each the size of a child's skull, arranged with too much intention. And in the center, a small pile of what looked like kindling. Only it wasn't wood. It was the ribbon. That frayed, bird-buttoned ribbon she had once tied to Uni's wrist, the one she had seen wrapped around the bone in the crib days before. Now it lay coiled among splinters of femurs and brittle shoulder blades. Arranged like an altar. Marnie staggered back a step. Brannick didn't follow. He stayed rooted at the perimeter, eyes fixed not on the altar but on the trees beyond, watching, guarding, and the girl. The girl reached toward the center. Calm and silent, Marnie pulled her close. "No," she whispered, "you don't have to." But the girl was no longer trembling. She turned her face toward Marnie, her expression unchildlike and distant, as though she had already seen what was coming. And then the sound returned, not from the trees or sky, but from the earth itself. A low bone-deep hum, like stone grinding against stone. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't loud. It was mourning, a sorrow so vast it had seeped into the cliff face and stayed there. Marnie collapsed to her knees, her arms still around the girl. Grief rose through her in waves. Not the sharp kind she'd carried for 7 years, but something older, something buried beneath time. Grief that did not belong to her, but moved through her all the same. She saw flashes behind her eyes. A different winter, a different woman holding a different child. A figure cloaked in fur kneeling in this very place while wolves watched from the trees. A woman who had lost her infant to the ice, whose cries had summoned the forest itself to remember. A memory, but not hers. The girl stepped from her arms. Barefoot, still wrapped in the quilt, she walked to the altar of bones and placed both hands on the kindling. The stones around it pulsed, not visibly, but emotionally, with a weight that pressed against the lungs. Brannick wind low in his throat, pacing in a tight arc behind her, anxious, restrained. Then the girl spoke a single word, low and guttural, not meant for Marnie to understand. The kindling caught flame, no match, no spark, just fire blue, and thin like candlelight, rising in a slow, deliberate dance around the ribbon and the bones. The wind didn't scatter it. The snow didn't touch it. The flame burned through the center of the circle without smoke, without ash, and as it rose, the hum beneath the ground began to fade. The stones stilled. Marnie stood, though she wasn't sure how. Her legs moved like a dream, heavy and distant. She took a step forward, but the girl turned and Marnie froze. The girl's eyes glowed faintly in the light, not bright, not supernatural, just wrong, not terrifying, ancient. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even sad. She looked complete. And then the wind returned, violent, sudden. It burst through the trees with the fury of a breath held too long. Snow lifted in spirals, the fire vanished, and the stones collapsed inward. The bones swept away like dust. Marnie shielded her face, coughing into her sleeve, calling the girl's name, though she didn't even know what to call her anymore. When the wind stilled, the altar was gone, so was the girl. The only thing that remained was Brannick standing, exactly where he had been. His fur was matted with frost, his eyes hollowed by something too large to process. He turned slowly, walked to Marnie, and laid his head against her knee. Marnie dropped to the ground and held his face in both hands. She didn't cry. The grief had changed shape. It was no longer a wound, it was a presence. A truth finally unearthed. The girl had never come back. She had never left. Whatever lived inside that forest, whatever memory the cliffs had kept, whatever curse had lingered, had always held her, protected her, waited for someone to remember, long enough, to care hard enough, to finish what sorrow began. And now, it was done. Marnie stayed until dusk, until the path back disappeared again under snow. She did not fear the woods anymore. That night she built a new fire in the cabin. She placed the ribbon on the mantel, above it a carving she'd etched into the wood long ago. Uni, just that. No date, no grave. Brannick lay beside the hearth, breathing slow, finally asleep. Outside, the snow fell again, silent, deep, soft, and the forest, for the first time in 7 years, exhaled. Winter faded slowly that year. The snow didn't melt so much as withdraw, like a tide receding after years of stillness. Marnie stayed in the cabin long past the date she'd planned to leave. The excuse she gave herself was that the roads were still too rough, but deep down, she knew the truth. She couldn't walk away just yet. Not from Brannick, not from the clearing, not from the weight that had finally lifted, leaving behind something stranger than peace, understanding. The forest had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. It no longer pressed in from all sides like a warning. It felt settled, as if the place had made its choice and could now rest. The circle of stones never returned. She checked each day for weeks, trudging back up the cliff trail as soon as the snowpack allowed. The altar was gone. No bones, no marks, not even an indent in the earth, but the ribbon remained on the cabin mantel unburnt. Marnie would often catch herself staring at it, not with sadness, but with a strange reverence, like a page torn from a story no one else would ever read. And she'd remember the sound, that deep hum beneath the earth, and the way the girl had stood so still at the center of it. That image came to her more vividly than her own memories. It was embedded now, somewhere deep and wordless. Brannick had aged overnight. Once the snow cleared and the storms stopped, his movement slowed, his body shrinking into the kind of weariness that didn't ask for help. He followed Marnie less, choosing instead to sleep by the hearth, one ear always tilted toward the window. He still rose whenever she approached the trail, but his steps were heavier now, his breath slower. One afternoon in early spring, as the meltwater rushed past the cabin and the first green pushed through the soil, Marnie found him lying beside the cot, the same place where the girl had once slept, his breathing shallow, his chest barely lifting. He didn't whimper, he didn't resist. His eyes, clouded and pale, met hers with something close to relief. She sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. "You kept her safe." Brannick let out a breath, long and quiet, and Marnie rested her forehead against his. He passed with no sound, no struggle, just a final exhale, like a guard who had waited too long for the watch to end. She buried him beneath the pine tree just behind the cabin near the stream. No stone, just a simple wooden marker carved with his name and one small line. He stayed. Spring deepened, life returned, and yet something sacred lingered in the trees. Animals began appearing again, cautiously. A doe and her fawn passed through the clearing one morning without pausing. Birds returned to the rafters of the cabin's porch. The land was remembering itself. But the cliff, she didn't go back, not until midsummer when she finally stood at the edge again. The wind greeted her gently, not harsh and cutting like it once had. The stones were still gone, but in their place grass had begun to grow, rich and full. And in the very center, where the bones had burned, a single sapling had rooted itself. It was young, fragile, with a thin trunk and soft leaves that shimmered silver in the light, like a whisper trying to become something permanent. Marnie crouched beside it and let her fingers brush the stem. It bent under her touch, not in weakness but an acknowledgement. Something had taken root. not just in the soil but in her dot. She had come here as someone trying to bury the past. She had stayed as someone forced to confront it. Now she was something else entirely, a witness, a keeper, not of ghosts but of what remained after the haunting ended. The story would never be told. Not properly, she wouldn't try. Not to the rangers, not to the locals who sometimes spoke of strange lights or whispered warnings about the cliffs. It belonged to the trees now, to the wind, and maybe to the girl, if she had ever really been a girl at all. Marnie returned to the cabin. One last time that night, she packed what little she'd brought, left the ribbon where it hung, and stood on the porch as the stars rose. There was no sound but the river and the rustling of the woods in full summer bloom. She didn't say goodbye. She simply turned, walked down the path, and disappeared into the forest, not as someone leaving, but as someone finally released. Behind her, the cabin stood quietly, and on the mantel, the ribbon shifted slightly in the breeze, no longer mourning, but remembering. On the cliff's edge, beneath a rising moon, the silver leaves of the sapling trembled gently, not in sorrow, in peace.